We have a group of people in the Corps of Engineers have been working together for decades now, looking at different attributes of the Yazoo Delta and the Mississippi River. I am the leader of a research team there at the Engineer Research and Development Center called ERDEC, and we're in the environmental lab, and we've been working for the Vicksburg District and the Mississippi Valley Division now for years under various types of programs. We have another, Dr. Neil Douglas, you'll see on the screen. He has worked with us. He's a great guy. He's the author of Fishes of Louisiana. And Neil has been with us on many of our field trips, has a lot of good memories. And most of the fish that we've collected in the Delta has actually been curated at the University of Louisiana Monroe Museum of Zoology. And we've had people that are revising their Fishes of books, and they'll come and look at our material. So it's a great resource that we have. Bill Lancaster is a commercial fisherman in Sunflower, Mississippi. Bill has been working with us, started a lot on our research on pallet sturgeon in the Mississippi, but he also assists us in a lot of our work here. And then our various sponsors and collaborators, and many of you probably recognize those names, and they've been important and had a lot of insight and forward thinking on some of the projects that we've had over the years. So I've been very fortunate to have such a great group of people working together on these kind of environmental issues. I'm gonna just kind of go through a basic some of the history of the of fish collections in the Mississippi River, because it is kind of interesting. If you look at this slide, does this thing work? Yeah. If you look at the era and then the years, you'll see that really that the first people who ever actually tried to collect fish in the Mississippi River was in the early 1800s. Wales and Audubon and Oliver Hay and Fanny Cook actually wrote the first Fishes of Mississippi. And so this was back in the 1960s. And this was called the era of the resurgence. Followed that with Neil Douglas, who I just mentioned, and Royal Sutcliffe, and there's others. And they started collecting fish and writing these Fishes of books, like Fishes of Louisiana, Fishes of Missouri, Fishes of Mississippi now, which is revised, was Fanny Cook, and now Steve Ross and some of his students have a really nice book on Fishes of Mississippi. But it wasn't until the environmental legislation started that the actual intensive collections began. When NEPA came out of Congress, that changed everything, particularly for the Corps of Engineers. I mean, the Corps was into navigation and flood control. I mean, what is this environmental thing going on? And fortunate for us, you know, some of the biologists coming out of school early on, we were able to come in at this early time and help the Corps work through the NEPA requirements. And then the Endangered Species Act. I would have to say the Endangered Species Act is probably the most powerful act that influences what goes on in these rivers nowadays. And so you had the Mississippi Valley Division had this program called the Lower Mississippi River Environmental Program. And that was really the first time we got comprehensive baseline evaluation of fishes of the Mississippi and the Mississippi River. Some in the Yazoo, but not yet. It wasn't really until my group and then others from Fish and Wildlife Service, the co-op unit in Mississippi State, Steve Miranda and Hal Schramm, and then in the State Fish and Wildlife Service Agency, I know Larry Pugh has, you know, he did work, his master's work on the Mississippi, and he's been promoting work from his biologists, doing more work on the Mississippi, which has been really good. And so it's been a collaboration developing over the years, really beginning in 1990 to the present. And that's where we are today. But we're not really into baseline assessment anymore. We've kind of worked out most of the impacts. What we're more interested in now is in the restoration, because the Corps got that third mission, ecosystem restoration. And so now we actually have authority to go in there and restore certain aquatic habitats. So if you look at the lower Mississippi River, and of course I know everyone can see the Yazoo Basin here. You know, there's levees that separate the main stem river from the Yazoo Basin, but most of the eastern side of the Mississippi is protected by the high-low bluffs. It's on the west side where you have a ring of levees go all the way down the river. And so my theme was a history of disconnection first, and I think we know that the levees that were built over time has disconnected the Mississippi River floodplain with the tributary floodplains. Used to be, it was all big one connection there. You could drive a boat from Vicksburg, Mississippi over to Monroe, Louisiana during the 1927 flood. And of course that's not possible now with the levees in place. So what you really have, because of the projects, actually the MR&T, the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, was the funding agency, began in 1928, right after the devastating 27 flood. That authorized the Corps to build levees and to train the river for year-round navigation. So what you have on the river side of the Mississippi River levees, you have this beautiful floodplain, forested floodplain with all these water bodies mixed in there. You get annual connection from the river into the floodplain up to the levee. And it looks a lot like it did even before development in some respects. Of course, it's been reduced 80%, but that 20% that's still out there is highly functional. And then you have, on the other side of the levee, the Yazoo Basin. So it's like stepping into another planet. You have this lush vegetation, forested wetlands here, and then most of the trees have been, land have been converted to agricultural crops. So a lot of our attention is placed here in the Yazoo Basin, and what can we do to restore some of these habitats, restore that connectivity? And that's kind of I'm going to touch upon first some of the studies and information we've derived on the Mississippi River side, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing on the Yazoo side. Really, I think that one of the major features of what's going on in the lower Mississippi River are the 16 cutoffs that were made in the 1930s and early 1940s. It actually reduced the length of the river by 154 miles. And so the Corps would go, and cutoffs are natural, but they occur over hundreds and hundreds of years. In this case, you had 14 of these cutoffs occur in about 3 years. And they would go in there and they would cut off the necks of these binways there and really kind of straighten out the river. And because of the cutoffs that happened back in the 40s and 30s and 40s, we now have part of the river is degradational, which is that part that was cut off, the cutoff region from really down to Natchez. Above that is kind of degradational. The river is continuing to cut into its bed, and then below the cutoffs is aggradational. The river's kind of rising. And that's a problem for the Corps of Engineers, who's trying to determine, what the flow lines are during floods and so forth. So it's a moving target. But these cutoffs, the point that I wanted to make on the cutoffs that were just really recently, I think, recognized, is that most of the cutoffs are still within the levee, within the Batture. And they represent some of the most unique, pristine wetland habitats left in the United States. And one way to illustrate that is to look at the width of the Batture. Now, the Batture is the land between the levees. That's what it's an old French term. Some people say Batture, but I've never have been able to master that. But we call it Batture here in Mississippi. But this is a slide. This is the width of the Batture in miles, and this is the river mile. And so once you get above Baton Rouge, you can see that even though the levees did cut off 80% of the floodplain, there are still a lot of areas here from levee to levee that's up to 14 miles long. And within that 14-mile chunk of land there, you have this really nice floodplain and the river and then the floodplain again. It's still a wilderness area in some cases. A colleague of mine, Paul Hartfield, wrote this article in Wilderness Magazine, and he did a great job of characterizing the lower Mississippi River as a wilderness area. Because there's still places on the Mississippi River that looks exactly like it did pre-development, just like Mark Twain in his riverboat days coming down the Mississippi. He would see a sandbar and a gravel bar, and a lot of those features are still there. So it's just a tremendous resource, and I always try to highlight the quality of the lower Mississippi River. It's really a jewel that we have in our own backyard. One of the the ways that we humans have to deal with environmental problems is that we have to classify everything. You know, we got to put a name on everything. It's either taxonomic name, like let's name all the fish, let's name all the phyla, let's put names on it. So we have to name the type of connections that the river has to different water bodies, and this is what I call the typology of connectivity. And this is the basis of some of our research out in the lower Mississippi River. We're trying to relate the type of connection the river has with another water body to the fish community that exists out there. And here you have, of course, the main channel, and a lot of your secondary channels are connected at both ends. And these are called eupotamal. And this classification was actually published for some European rivers, and we just adopted this terminology here for the lower Miss. And then you have, it's just connected at one end. A lot of your secondary channels will just have, at low water, only the lower end is connected to the main stem river. The upper end, which is at higher elevation, is usually cut off. But believe me, they are fish and Asian carp. If you're looking for Asian carp, this is the place to look for, because the mouths of these secondary channels where the upstream is cut off attracts a lot of fish, including your Asian carp. And then you have your peripotamal. That's your peripotamal, your plesiopotamal, and these may have been former meander bends and scars of the river, but they're not really directly connected. They're usually got canals and little tie channels that connect them. And then closer to the levee, you have water bodies that are hardly ever connected. And back in the days before the levees, you know, these type of paleopotamal connections may have been 30, 40 miles from the river, but now they're much closer, and so we really may not really have paleopotamal. But keep in mind this type of classification, because this is the basis of our research, like I mentioned, at Island 63. I just wanted to, this is a multidisciplinary effort funded by the Corps of Engineers under a program called the Potamology program, and potamology is a study of river science. So it's the Mississippi River Geomorphology and Potamology program. And so we have a study reach. It's about a 35-mile reach where we're doing all these different types of biological and physical studies looking at the relationships between the river and these connected or disconnected floodplains. This is Island 63 here, and there is a closing dike right about here. It was the first closing dike that was notched by the Lower Mississippi River Conservation Committee. The LMRCC has been notching closing dikes into secondary channels, and I think they're up to about like almost 20 channels that they have actually reopened and enhanced the connectivity of the secondary channel to its parent river. And so we're studying these secondary channels, and here's Island 63 and Island 64, and we're also looking at this big forested area right here, and that's Burke's property, right outside of Clarksdale. And so the river engineers and the hydraulic engineers have been working with us on determining the connectivity between these different water bodies on Burke's property. Those eupotamal and those peripotamal and that classification I was talking about. Well, we now know at what stage each of these water bodies are connected, so we can determine the frequency of connection and the time of connection and the duration of connection. And we can use that then to help characterize the fish communities which we have. We go in there with different collecting techniques, with our gill nets and our seines and our trawls and our trot lines, and we've just been sampling, we've just been throwing everything in the world at these things, just trying to figure out how's the best way to characterize a fish community in water bodies that connect differently with each other. And I know this looks like a shotgun blast, but it actually has some patterns to it. And if you'll bear with me, these are the type of connections, these symbols. That's eupotamal, peripotamal, plesio, and paleo. And what this is, it's kind of a multivariate ordination program that looks at the relationship of one sample to all the other samples. So all the samples are compared to each other based upon the relative abundance of the fish that we're collecting at these different water bodies. And what it shows is that you can actually use, this is seining data only. So you can use a simple seine and go in there and take a sample out of a water body and oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let me go back here. previous. Sorry. Oop. Well, okay. Not sure what to hit here. Hmm? Okay. Okay. Back. So what we have is the, it really doesn't matter what season that you sample, but the fish community is separated by its connectivity. So this fish community is made up more of riverine fish. As you get over here in these reds where it's peripotamal, remember that's like the lower end of a secondary channel that's connected only. You get this kind of community right here. So we have now a tool that we can come up and we can use, and you say, well, why do we need to know this information? Well, the reason is that the Corps of Engineers, has to do environmental impact statements on all of their projects. In order to do EISs, you have to determine the impacts of their project on fish community and other important environmental resources. This gives us the capability of going into any water body now and characterizing and determining the impacts or mitigation requirements of changing water body connectivity. We also have Dr. Cliff Oakes at the University of Mississippi, and he's a limnologist. He's also working with us, and he's looking at the biochemistry of these floodplains. He's looking at the nutrients that are going in and out, and we all heard about the Gulf hypoxia. Well, once that Mississippi River water goes into these backwaters, this is Melwood right here, by the way, then you have a sequestering of those nutrients. The actual nitrogen level drops down, and so by the time that water comes back out of the backwater, it has less nutrients in it, which would help benefit or reduce the Gulf hypoxia problem. There's also another question that we had is that how can the tremendous diversity of the Mississippi River be continuing to thrive like it does? What fuels that? Well, it's clear from his studies, and he's shown that the production coming out of these backwaters into the river is fueling this biomass. It's fueling the diversity of fishes there. And so by enhancing connectivity, we maintain the integrity of this system. Another collaborator, Dr. Steve Miranda at the USGS Co-op at Mississippi State University, along with his former graduate student, Nathan Aycock, started sampling oxbow lakes in the Yazoo Delta and in the floodplain of the Mississippi River, over in the White River Refuge, and started developing what we call a multivariate index. And so going with a shocker boat into a oxbow lake and taking a particular sample and then looking at the fish community based upon that sample, you can then develop what he developed and Nathan developed was a multivariate index. So again, we have yet another tool at our disposal to characterize the condition and the quality of oxbow lakes. And what this illustrates is this is the cumulative percentage of these different sites. These are different lakes. And the index is, if it goes from a -2 to a +2, so it goes from very poor to very high quality habitat. And these are the metrics that he calculates from that multivariate index. So he looks at a lot of different ways of describing the fish community. And what this shows is that in the Yazoo Delta, that most of the lakes score fairly low. Once you get into the White River Refuge across the river up there, then you have really high quality. And a lot of it's because a lot of those lakes are still surrounded by bottomland hardwood forests. That's one of the primary drivers here. But I just wanted to illustrate and let you know that this information is available. So I've talked a little bit about the Mississippi. Let's talk about the Yazoo Delta. Let's jump on the other side of the levee and see what's going on there. We started sampling the Yazoo Delta back in about 1990, really, and it was for flood control. It was for the Big Sunflower Maintenance Project, the Upper Yazoo projects, a lot of those flood control projects. We were sampling those for the first time, and we've amassed a huge database over the years that that we've enjoyed. I mean, we have a lot of fun out there, and I tell you, anyone who's been in Delta streams know how muddy they are. And so you have, and sometimes that mud gets so deep you just can hardly get out of it. But by golly, we persevered, and we've been looking at almost every stream, water body there is in the Yazoo Delta over the years. And this is kind of a conceptual model of what's going on. And this doesn't really apply not only to the Yazoo Delta, but any agricultural landscape that we're dealing with here. You have these stressors, which are you reduce the forest area, increase sedimentation in the streams, and then reduce stream flow. And we all know the problem with the disconnection between the surface and the groundwater. And so you end up having a degraded stream. Well, what we have been doing with the Vicksburg District, with Kent Parish and all those folks is that, especially in the Steel Bayou, the Upper Steel Bayou project is a good example of this, is that we're trying to establish riparian buffers. I'm talking about 1 or 2 trees, not huge buffers, but just something to shade and to provide woody debris back into these streams. That's what I'm talking about, riparian buffers, maybe 50 feet or something like that. Drop pipes to keep the sediment out on the ag land. And then weirs are actually flow enhancement. And if you have these management actions, you're going to have positive effects all the way down with endpoints that you would like to kind of restore some of the functionality, restore some of this, bring some of the species of fish that have been extirpated from these sites, bring those back up into the river itself. And we've shown that this happens. I mean, you can actually have a positive response. We have developed, I'm not going to get into the data, but we have developed, similar to what Steve Miranda did, a multivariate index for delta stream fishes. So now we have all these great indices that we can use in order to look at different alternatives, different impacts, and the mitigation of those impacts. But I'm not going to get into that. One of the conclusions that you can make is that the quality of the streams in the Yazoo Basin can be directly tied to the flow regime. And that, of course, that makes perfect sense. And what's happened is that here, I mean, we sampled all through the lower Mississippi River Valley. And some of these have perennial flow. The flow never stops. There's always flow in there. And what's happened in some of these sites down here is that it's more intermittent flow. You have temporary rivers. The flow just ceases, and a lot of it's because of the loss of its contact with the groundwater. And so how do you deal with that? Dave Johnson at the Vicksburg District showed on a decade by decade basis how the discharge at the Big Sunflower River at Sunflower has decreased over the decades. The low flow has, and so here you have the 80s and 90s. The low flow, the 90% is over here, on 30 or 40. It used to be much higher in the hundreds, and that's the result of a disconnection between the groundwater and the surface water. And so you have these really low flow problems throughout the unregulated rivers in the Yazoo Delta. But I'm telling you, there is some oasis out there. It's like if you're in the desert and you see this beautiful palm trees along this water supply, there is an oasis out there. Above Indianola, Mississippi, there are a series, it's about a 5 or 6 mile stretch where you have gravel bars that are still exist in the Big Sunflower River. And we did not realize that these gravel bars were at such high quality, and I've been trying to figure out how did they survive all of the flood control measures that have been implemented over the years, but somehow they did. There were other gravel bars in the Big Sunflower prior to development, no doubt about it, but this one is still intact, where you have perennial flow, so the groundwater, I guess, is still connected to the surface water at low water. I'm sure some of it's irrigation return water, but even after the irrigation season, these gravel bars continue to flow even at low water. And one of the surprising things we found out 2 months ago was that it has a lot of rabbit's foot mussels. Rabbit's foot mussel is a federally threatened species, and they're thriving in these gravel bars, live mussels everywhere. And this is what they look like. They kind of look like a rabbit's foot. That's why, that's how they named it, I guess. And so stay tuned on that. We're doing a lot more work and trying to understand more about these gravel bars. But in order to mitigate the problem of intermittent flow in all of our delta streams, we need to have some sort of environmental flow, some sort of an augmentation of flow. And if you look in South Louisiana, that's what they're doing. they're breaching the levees and putting water out into the marshes to try to build land. That's all part of the coastal restoration program. This is Davis Pond, which can allow 10,000 CFS to go through there. It's a structure. And I'm saying, well, why can't we do that maybe in the, bring water from the Mississippi into our delta streams that have been suffering? And certainly, a lot of the ways they move water in South Louisiana is either through a structure or a siphon. And these are just some examples of siphons that go over the levee. And so say, for example, if we wanted to rewater the Big Sunflower River, well, we could probably take it right through Moon Lake. Moon Lake was used historically during the Civil War when Ulysses Grant's fleets went through at high water through Moon Lake and tried to outflank Vicksburg. Of course, there's a levee there now, so that would create some issues, but it would cost some money, is what I'm saying. But if you brought, say, a siphon over and just put 300 CFS through that siphon, that's all, then you could route that down into the Big Sunflower River, all the way down here. You could route it over here to the Coldwater River, the Tallahatchie, to augment some of this flow. And you could even bring it down here in a short distance and reconnect Cassidy Bayou. So there are a lot of different ideas that you could come up with, and I know that many of you in this room are familiar with the Tallahatchie Quiver project that's currently being evaluated, where they're talking about bringing water from the Tallahatchie, and of course the water coming out of the Tallahatchie is fed by Enid and Sardis reservoirs, and also Arca Butler. They all three come together and come down the Tallahatchie. They're talking about bringing like a couple of hundred CFS for environmental flows, and then add about 300 CFS, up to 300 for irrigation flows. And so you would bring it out of the Tallahatchie, you could restore some bayous on the way, bring it into the Quiver, and then farmers would take water out of the Quiver River based upon their needs. So that's another example of something that can be done on a large scale to improve the quality and the habitat quality and the fisheries of the Yazoo Basin. And this is what we will get. This is what we're trying to get back to. We call these rheophilic species. These are flow-loving fish. A lot of them are the minnows and the darters, but these are the fish that have virtually disappeared from our rivers because of intermittent flows. There's just not enough flow out there to sustain them. We might find them in the Yazoo or the Tallahatchie or the Yallabusha that are fed by the flood control reservoirs, but we don't see them in the Big Sunflower, the Quiver, and the Steele for the most part. There are remnant populations, but so this is our end point. This is what we're trying to get back to, is to start collecting these kind of fish back into our river systems. And every time I bring this up, there's always someone that says, okay, if you start bringing flow in from the Mississippi River, you're going to bring in Asian carp, you're going to bring in zebra mussels. But I say, hey, they're already here. I mean, an interbasin transfer of flow is not going to affect one way or the other the occurrence and abundance of Asian carp and zebra mussels. And also the nutrients. So I mean, I just put this up there to say that these are valid points that need to be worked through, but I think that there is a solution for all of it. And I like to end my presentation here just to point out that that in our work on the Mississippi River, we've tagged fish here in Louisiana and have recaptured them up in the Missouri in Gavin's Point almost. We have documented up to 1,200 miles of movement. And so if you look at the Missouri River, that's the first dam on the Missouri River. It's 1,200 miles to the mouth of the Mississippi, and then another 1,200 miles down to the mouth of the Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico. That's almost 2,500 miles. We have the longest unobstructed aquatic corridor in the United States, and it flows just right next door to us, right outside our door. And I think that that's something that we should recognize and appreciate. So that's all I have. Kind of a quick summary and history of what's been going on with the Corps over the last 100 years, but I'll be glad to answer any questions if we have time, or you want to move on?
Let's hold a question.
Okay.